Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. Graphics card performance comparison. We are testing three different graphics cards today. First, the Intel integrated HD 630 graphics chip in the 7th generation of Intel processors, the AMD RX 560 4GB card, and the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1050 Ti 4GB card. The computer used for testing is the $450 Acer Aspire T desktop computer. I've previously reviewed this computer, link to that review in the video description below. Full playlist of videos on this computer, check it out if you're interested. Fraps was used for the game performance numbers you'll see at the end of the video, but it was not used to capture the video. An Elgato HD60S external capture box was used for the video capture, and the numbers in green at the top left of the screen are from MSI Afterburner. Please note that links to the computer system and the two graphics cards are in the video description below to Amazon and Newegg as appropriate. Please check them both, compare prices, and buy it where it makes the most sense to you. Today we are playing World of Tanks. 1080p resolution, but at two different detail settings. That's because the integrated graphics, the HD 630, absolutely cannot play this game at even high detail, much less max. So we're playing at low detail right now on the HD 630. Both of the add-in graphics cards will be at max detail. One of the benefits of a video such as this is it shows you just how much of a performance difference there really is between around $100 to $130 graphics cards and integrated graphics. Yes, Intel has improved their integrated graphics in recent years. It's much better than it was 5 years ago, but frankly, add-in graphics cards have also improved tremendously, so there is still a massive difference in performance. Even if you turn this game to medium, on the HD 630, it simply is not playable. It is a slideshow. Performance drops down into the 20s very quickly. Some setting between medium and low is just destroying performance, so we're playing it low today. If you look at the real-time numbers in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, you'll notice that we have less information than we will on the other two replays and on most of the ones I've published in the past. That's because this is integrated graphics. There's no actual graphics card with a fan or separate VRAM to actually show you a memory clock speed because it's using main system RAM. Now there is one change that I've made recently. If you've watched my prior videos on the Acer Aspire T $450 desktop computer, you'll see that all the performance benchmarks have been done with 16 gigabytes of RAM. Yet if you look at the top, you'll see we only have 8 gigs of RAM installed. Why? I decided to pull one of the two memory sticks out and run it in the default shipping configuration. I wanted to see how well this would run on these type of games as it comes out of the box, either with or without a graphics card installed. The reason being is for games like World of Tanks, World of Warships, League of Legends, and that sort of thing, you really don't need 16 gigs of RAM, and I imagine many people looking for a budget gaming machine will spend $450 on this excellent pre-built computer, drop in a $100 to $130 graphics card, and call it a day without making any further upgrades. Now it is true that by having only 8 gigabytes of RAM, we are running in single channel mode. Does that make a large difference? No. I might at some point do a video showing the difference between single channel and dual channel, but here's the thing at the end of the day. If you're going to spend the $50 to $60 that it costs to buy a second 8 gigabyte memory stick to install in this computer because you want the integrated graphics to run faster, really that money should be put into a graphics card, because the reality is with 8 gigs of RAM and a dedicated graphics card, you'll get a whole bunch more performance than by simply adding extra RAM and putting it in dual channel mode. Still a good upgrade. 16 gigs of RAM is definitely nice, but it's not going to make the difference between playable and not playable between two different graphics settings. Now as we just drove through the trees here, you'll see the frame rate varies wildly. It just dropped down to 30, in fact it dropped down into the 20s for just a second as we were driving through the trees. This is why I'm doing 1% and 0.1% lows rather than strictly minimum numbers, because over the course of a 5 or 10 minute game, if it only comes down to 20 or 30 frames per second for a second, then that's not really reflective of the overall performance, and the 1% lows are really the numbers that I think you should focus on. That was actually a good shot right there, rather than strict minimums, which is the lowest single frame out of the course of perhaps a 10-minute run of a match. It is worth noting that the graphics detail at low is noticeably and dramatically worse than it is at max. When you watch the next two replays here in just a second, you'll see how much lush and greener, the better the grass looks, the better the tanks look. But the reality is the game is the same either way. If you simply don't have the money or don't play enough games to justify spending some money on a dedicated graphics card, can you play World of Tanks at low detail on an HD 630? Yes, you absolutely can. Look how well this plays. Except for a few drops here and there, it really is actually fine. I would like to further point out that I did not just play one game on each graphics chip and call that a day. I played several. Here we are on the RX 560. Now before I talk about this, I want to finish that thought. I did play several games, partly because in some of the matches I died too quickly to get a decent run. Here I'm going to show you the settings that we're running at. There we are, full screen, 1080p. We are at 60 Hz refresh rate, maximum detail. There we go. If you look in the upper right hand corner, you'll see the fraps numbers. That's because I don't actually start the actual benchmark until the game itself actually starts. So none of that initial setup, none of this just sitting here waiting, is included in that run. Only the actual gameplay. You can see the numbers have gone away. That's because the benchmark itself has actually started. Anyway, back to the point of playing multiple matches. Too many times you die in the first 2 or 3 minutes, and 2 or 3 minutes is not long enough to get enough highs, lows, peaks, valleys, etc. to drive across the terrain, zoom in, zoom out, have tanks explode. That last battle, for example, you saw to completion. This one will be to completion. So I do usually end up playing 3 or 4 battles on each graphics chip in order to actually get a run that is long enough in order to have a good result. It also gives me a chance to see what is consistent performance across maps. Notice we're on a different map this time than last time. That is an unavoidable consequence of playing an online only game. I can't select which map I'm going to get in World of Tanks. And I also can't guarantee that I'll get a run long enough to be useful. If I actually wanted to test these 3 cards and guarantee the same map across each graphics chip and have a run long enough and good enough to be worthy of actually using that benchmark run, that Fraps run, I might spend 2 days testing this. It's simply not practical. The inability to select the map that we run on unfortunately causes the maps to be different. There isn't much I can do about that one. Let's talk about the specific performance numbers. You'll notice the green MSI Afterburner numbers have much more information than they did last time. The first percentage you see up there, which currently says 100%, that is how much compute power our graphics card is using. Well, it dips down occasionally, but it generally sits at 100%. Then we have the temperature of the graphics chip itself, right about 70 degrees Celsius. That's pretty normal. And then we have the fan speed in terms of a percentage. The fan on this graphics card is currently turning at 64% of its max speed, which translates into about 2300 RPM. Finally, we have the clock speed of the chip, 1300 megahertz, and you can see it is a very fixed solid speed. Now this is the out-of-the-box speed of this card. This is the Sapphire 4GB card. It's running at 1300 megahertz, and as you can see, it's not throttling, it's not changing or jumping, it's running at a fixed speed. So this is a very, very stable card. I have been happy with it. I've now tested this in 3 different machines. It's provided very consistent, reliable performance in each of them. Next up, we have the VRAM. Now this card has 4 gigabytes of VRAM and currently costs about $115. You can save $15 by buying the 2 gigabyte version for $99 if you prefer, and on games such as World of Tanks, World of Warships, League of Legends, etc., 2 gigabytes of VRAM is actually all you need. However, for $15, I would be inclined to buy the 4 gig version for just a bit of future proofing. Textures will improve. You don't know when the next game update is going to want more textures. World of Tanks may very well come out with a graphical update at some point in the future, or whatever game you play, and then require more VRAM. Notice at max detail we're using just under 2 gigs of VRAM, 1.8. Now this would play at exactly this same performance on the 2 gig version of this card today. What's it going to do in a year? Will it want more? Who can say? Now you can always adjust graphic settings. There we are running through the water, but we'll get through it just fine. You can of course adjust graphic settings to keep within the limitations of a 2 gig card, and if you find a deal on a 2 gig card, if the 2 gig card ends up being say $30 or $40 less than the 4 gig card, or perhaps you just, wherever you live, maybe you don't live in the US and there's a larger price difference, sure, the 2 gig card is fine. But if there's only a $15 price difference, I recommend the 4 gig card for that price difference. CPU usage is at a very calm 27, 32, 33%, nothing. This game does not need an i5. In fact, if you have a Pentium G4560, this game plays exactly the same, no issues whatsoever. Temperature on our CPU, look at that, an incredibly cool 40 degrees Celsius. This is running on the stock cooler. Remember, this is a $450 Acer Aspire pre-built in a small mini tower without a lot of case cooling on basically a stock cooler. The modern Intel clock-locked i5 chips are incredibly cool running and really have no temp issues whatsoever. Main system RAM, not even 4 gigabytes used. This is why I pulled the extra 8 gigabytes out to show you what it would run out of the box. Because the whole advantage of this machine is, as a budget computer, if you're going to buy a $100 graphics card and a $450 pre-built, you're a casual player, you only play World of Tanks, look at this. We're getting over 60 frames per second, max detail, 1080p, with about $550, $560 invested total between the computer and the graphics card. Now, there certainly are higher performance options on the market. You could, for example, put a GTX 1060 in this machine. I've had one of those in here before, and they do work fine with the included power supply. RX 570 and 580 cards would require replacing the power supply, and most will have trouble fitting due to the physical size and the relatively small size of this machine. If you want more performance than either of the cards I'm showing you today, then a GTX 1060 would be my recommendation, and the EVGA superclocked version, because I can guarantee it fits and I can guarantee it works using the 300 watt power supply, and it is substantially faster than both of these cards, but it does cost more. And if this is the sort of game you want to play, it's completely unnecessary to spend the money or mess around with it, because look, we're getting 76, 78 frames per second. It's performing very well. In fact, I want you to make a note of this point right here. I hope you're watching this. Now, timestamps are in the video description below. Some of you, that should have killed him. I shot right into the underbelly of the tank, but whatever. In any case, I want you to make note of this point right now, because when you look at the game performance numbers at the end of this video, and this is the problem with benchmark charts, it would be very easy to say, oh, well, I know which card I'm buying because look at the charts. Well, forget the charts for a minute. If you want a budget computer, you're probably going to be on a budget monitor, which means you're probably playing on a 1080p 60 Hz monitor. Turn VSync on to get rid of the screen tearing, and you're going to be running at a locked 60 frames per second. Well, except for the few times it dips below that. So with a 60 Hz monitor, with VSync turned on, the game will not run over 60 frames per second. So even if you installed the GTX 1060 and you were getting 120 frames per second, you'd never see it because you'd be locked to 60. Now, you can turn VSync off, it's true, and you'll run faster, but the screen won't display it because the 60 Hz monitor is physically incapable of displaying more than 60 frames per second, because 60 Hz means that's how often the screen physically refreshes itself. Now, you might have a 100 or 144 Hz 1080p monitor, but then I would ask the question, are you really plugging it into a $100 graphics card? Maybe then buying a 1060 makes sense if you're going to have a higher refresh rate display. So when you look at the results, keep in mind that if you have a 60 Hz monitor, this is already faster than that. Now let's skip ahead to the GTX 1050 Ti. Now this card is about $15 more expensive than the RX 560, and a very common question that many people will ask is it worth the money? Should I save a little bit of money and buy an RX 560, or should I spend just a little bit more and get a GTX 1050? Please note, prices change constantly. Deals, sales, mail-in rebates, things happen. So when I'm filming this video, the RX 560 4GB card was $115 and the GTX 1050 Ti's were about $130. Those will change in the future. If you don't live in the US, or perhaps it's a month from now, those prices are going to be different, so keep that in mind when you consider the performance numbers you see, the prices I talk about, and the dollars per frame rate charts you see at the end of this video. If you find these cards for a different price, you'll need to do the math, divide the price by the frame rate to get a different number to figure out which card is actually less expensive per frame. Now, for those of you curious which card I'm testing today, this is actually the Gigabyte GTX 1050 Ti that I recently reviewed on my channel. I have done most of my previous game performance videos with the EVGA Superclocked card. I love the EVGA Superclocked card. It actually runs a little bit faster than this out of the box. Both can be overclocked, but I generally run graphics cards on the out-of-the-box configuration because I don't believe the majority of people manually overclock their cards. Some people do, but I think most people rely on the automatic overclocking of GPU Boost to do it for you, and it does a fine job. Look, we're running at about 1650 megahertz. Now, right away, if you look at the real-time frame rate, you might notice something. 2 points. 1, yes, this card is faster. 2, we're on a different map, which does affect that a bit. However, buildings, trees, terrain, fire, zoomed in, it all affects it. Because this is an online game, it's never going to be exactly the same from match to match. There's no built-in benchmarking tool. Again, I cannot force the same map. So take the results with a small grain of salt. However, let me just say up front, and this should be obvious from looking at the real-time performance number. Is the GTX 1050 Ti faster in World of Tanks than an RX 560? Yes. Does it matter? As I said before, do you have a 60 Hz display? This is trivial, it makes no difference. Turn VSync on, they both run at 60 frames per second. Now, if you have a 100 or 144 Hz display 1080p, well, then the 1050 Ti might be a better choice because it'll get you a faster frame rate. Unless perhaps you have a FreeSync monitor, in which case you might want the RX 560 for FreeSync support, which this card does not have. Now, this card does have another benefit that the RX 560 that I'm testing does not have. This card does not require a 6-pin PCI Express power connector. My Sapphire RX 560 4GB card does. Now, I did use the 2 Molex connector to single 6-pin PCI Express power connector in this Acer Aspire T on that RX 560. Works perfectly. I've done multiple games. I've even played the Division on it, which is challenging, but it does do the job and it works just fine. So the 300 watt power supply that comes with this $450 Acer Aspire T works great. Using the 2 4-pin Molex adapter to the single 6-pin PCI Express power connector, it'll run a GTX 1060 or an RX 560 without complaint. Inevitably, this is the point where somebody says, yeah, but what about the RX 570? Most won't fit in the machine, they're physically too big. In fact, I did a video about this where I physically held the cards up to the machine and showed you why size was an issue. If you're buying this computer and you want more than a 1050 Ti or a RX 560, please save yourself a whole world of trouble and just buy a short single fan GTX 1060 and make your life much, much easier. I would make the point that if you really want an AMD card because you have a FreeSync monitor and you really want something like this level of performance, then the $720 CyberPower gaming PC that I've reviewed on my channel extensively, it has an RX 480, which is really close to the performance of a 580. It has an i5 7400 processor. It's $720, but most notably, it comes in a bigger case with a 600 watt power supply and supports a lot more upgrades. A little bit more expensive, but a lot more future-proof in the ability to upgrade. Nice kill shot right there. Boom! Right into the side of his turret. Don't show me the side of your turret. I'll put a big, huge shell through it. Anyway, so if you really want AMD and you want more performance, that's the direction I would go. VRAM usage, about 1.7, 1.8 gigabytes. You can see our CPU usage is below 50%, so an i3 or a Pentium G4560 would be enough. However, the price of this computer is so compelling, and the fact that it gives you an i5, I really think this is the deal. If you're looking to spend about $550 for gaming, drop in a 1050 Ti or an RX 560, you'll get anywhere between 60 to 100 frames per second in many current games, not all, but many. 8 gigs of RAM is definitely enough for the kind of games that you're going to play on a 1050 Ti or an RX 560. I will say that for these it doesn't matter, and I know that if you've watched my previous videos, I've harped on the 16 gig issue. If you install a GTX 1060 in this computer, and you plan to play The Division and Ghost Recon Wildlands and GTA 5, yes, put the extra 8 gigs of RAM in, absolutely, without any doubt whatsoever. But if you're putting a $100 graphics card in playing World of Tanks and League of Legends, no, it's not really necessary. I don't know if I noticed it at the time, but if you look at the tank counter up at the top, I am standing alone against 3 enemies. I've done my share of damage here, I've done my share of shooting, I've taken my share of damage, but I don't think I'm going to win this battle, unfortunately, because somebody is now shooting me from behind, and I am on fire, and my tank is not going to last very long. Well, why don't we go take a look at some results? And here we are at the results. Now, if you actually watched this entire video and did not use the timestamps in the description below to skip ahead, very little here should surprise you. But in case you did skip ahead or maybe didn't watch it all, here's the short version. Yes, the 1050 Ti is faster. However, if you're playing on a 60 Hz 1080p monitor, it really doesn't make that big of a difference because the maximum frame rate you're going to get is 60 frames per second, and all of these options will provide you with at least an average of 60 frames per second. It is true that the RX 560 does not have a 1% minimum of 60. It's down at 46. Compare that to the 1% minimum on the 1050 Ti at 68. The maps are different, so it does have a small effect. However, I can tell you across playing multiple games, the 1050 Ti really is faster than the RX 560, at least in World of Tanks. I will have upcoming game performance videos in other games, and the results might be a bit different in those. Let me talk about the HD 630 for a minute. We had an average of 81 frames per second. That looks really nice, right up until you consider the fact that the frame rate dipped tremendously at various points. In fact, you can see that we had a 0.1% low of 21 and a 1% low of 38. It's playable. It's smooth most of the time until it isn't. But if it's all you've got and you've just got to make it work because you don't have the money to add a graphics card in at low detail, it in fact does play well enough. Now this next chart that I'm going to show you is a little bit different. I've done it once before, I'm doing it again. Dollar cost per frame per second. The RX 560 costs less than the GTX 1050 Ti. They both go on sale from time to time, but generally there's about a $15 to $20 price difference most of the time between these two cards. However, if you take the frame rate that I just showed you in World of Tanks and divide it into the price of the card, you'll notice something. The 1050 Ti is actually the less expensive card on a per unit of performance basis. If you take the average, the 1% minimum and the 0.1% minimum, divide them into the cost, you'll notice that we have $1.29 per frame per second on the 1050 Ti, but $1.72 on the RX 560. In fact, for the RX 560 to be roughly equal in terms of dollar cost per frame per second, it would have to be well under $100. Now, if you can find an RX 560 for, say, $70 or $80, then it would be much more competitive in World of Tanks performance. There will be other games that I test where this number will be closer. This is just one example of one game between these two cards. However, it's a great way of looking at the fact that a more expensive card might actually be less expensive because this might not be the only game you want to play. You might want to play future games, and because the 1050 Ti is in fact a bit faster, it actually costs less for the performance it gives you. Please like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below. Post your comments below the video. Video description has all the links to everything in this video. The 2 video cards, the Acer Aspire T system will all be down there both for the playlist, the reviews, and the links to Amazon and Newegg. Please check those out. Finally, please consider supporting me on Patreon if you are able to. Nothing in this video was provided by any of these manufacturers, not even the AMD graphics card. They did send me the 550, which I previously reviewed, but they did not send me this 560. I bought this off of Newegg myself. So if you like my channel and you like my videos and you want to see more independent reviews and analysis with honest results, direct support from viewers like you is the best way to do that. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.